So when you are unknown, you begin with initial credibility. This is the credibility that a speaker has before they get up and speak. Think about chapel, for instance. How much initial credibility does a chapel speaker have to you? A lot or a little? So because you have a bit of a relationship, a bit of familiarity with Ammon, he has a higher level of initial credibility. Frankie, you didn't have any awareness of, so he doesn't have very much initial credibility. I don't know him from Adam. Okay? What else impacts the amount of initial credibility somebody has? What gave Frankie a little bit more credibility than he would have had otherwise? His introduction. Somebody introduced him and said, man, I just love Dr. Frankie. I love his heart, I love his preaching, etc., etc. And you're like, oh, if he thinks a lot of Dr. Frankie, then maybe I ought to listen to him. So an introduction can serve to bump that initial credibility up a little bit. It's not gonna give us a ton. I mean, it's not gonna be the same as if some big name preacher was coming in who we're aware of, and we know, I mean, he's been doing this for 30 years, his church is 30,000 people, people love listening to him. I mean, Andy Stanley comes to preach at chapel. Does he have initial credibility? Well, to anybody in the church world who knows preaching, yeah, because he's Andy Stanley. But if you don't, then no. But for me, for any professor on campus, for anybody who's been in a preaching class, if we said, hey, Andy Stanley's coming to preach in chapel, guess how much initial credibility he has for those people? Like a maximum. You can't have more initial credibility than that. But for somebody you don't know, like for Joe, Andy Stanley's not going to have a whole lot of initial credibility until he gets introduced. And then you start hearing he's written all these books, his church is 30,000 people, and he has written a book on preaching. You're like, oh, okay, this guy's legit. And so his initial credibility starts going up a little bit. So there's initial credibility. Then the next layer to it is derived credibility. This is the credibility that is earned once they open their mouths. So it's not like, I've heard this guy preach for 18 years. We're in the first sermon. I realize 5 minutes in, man, I'm captivated. I'm engaged by this. I'm respecting this guy, even though I know very little about him. I see him as ethical. I see him as trustworthy. And so I'm focused. I'm zoned in. That's derived credibility. Ultimately, though, what you're shooting for is lasting credibility. This is what continues throughout the seasons, throughout the years, throughout the decades. So this is that preacher who, honestly, may be a pretty lousy preacher. But you know, man, this guy, he loves Jesus. He loves people. He's trustworthy. He's caring. He would do anything for you. And so even if his sermon is, I'm still going to listen. Why? Because he loves me, and I love him in return. That's lasting credibility. And ultimately, that's what every speaker should desire to attain, is that lasting credibility as an ethical speaker, where people are just going to say, you know what? I trust him. He's earned my trust over the years. He's earned my ear over the years. So all of these are important. You want to try and build up all of them, but the ultimate desire is to attain lasting credibility as a speaker, as someone who is viewed as an ethical speaker.